So,
Cue you then.
well, both of us saw it in 48 frames 3D. You're going to go and see it in IMAX
Again?
Yeah, in high frame rate 3D. I mean, I think, and we'll get on to that. Okay, let's first.
It isn't the most important thing.
It isn't the most important thing, but we will talk about that in a while. Here's the most important thing: The Hobbit is too long, and there isn't any way of dressing that up. It is too long. It's a short book, and dividing it into 3 movies, each one of which, or at least the first one of which, is 3 hours long, is too long. And it's a very bizarre thing because in the past, if you're dealing with the Lord of the Rings books, and they are individually quite right, there is a certain amount of compression anyway, even if you're making a 3-hour movie. But the idea of making something that is The Hobbit into 3-hour movies is stretching a point. Also, when The Hobbit started, and Guillermo del Toro was on board to do it, and then various things happened, and finally he had to back out of the project. I had a conversation with him in which I said, well, where are you going to, he was going to make it into 2 movies. I said, well, where are you going to break it? I mean, it's not a very big book. It's a small book. He said, no, but it's funny. If you get the book and you break it open right in the middle of the book, there is a very clear midpoint. There is a point which is a climactic thing happens. I'm not going to say what, just because, some people haven't read the book.
Is it an unfortunate event?
No, it's not an unfortunate. There is a spectacular fighty climax, which is indeed, and he said, and that's clearly end of part 1. And then you begin part 2. Well, that is where part 1 ends now. So you're now halfway through and you've still got another 2 movies to go. So there is no 2 ways around it. There are no 2 ways around this. It is too long. And what that means is at the very beginning, I mean, actually, if you read The Hobbit, the beginning of The Hobbit, for me, was fairly hard work because there is an awful lot of describing the cutlery and describing the chairs and describing the songs that they used to sing.
It's quite faithful to that, then?
It is very faithful to that, but it is faithful to that in a way which feels like, okay, can we get out of the Shire and get on with things? The other problem is, and again, we'll talk about this more in a bit, the 48 frames issue is problematic in some ways. One way in which it's problematic is that some people have described watching the 48 frame stuff as making things look like high definition television. When it was first played at Comic-Con, people said it looks like behind the scenes footage. Peter Jackson said something very interesting. He said it's not like watching a cinema screen. He said it's like taking the cinema screen away and looking through it to something actually happening behind it. Well, in the early scenes, when they're in Bilbo Baggins' house, when they're in the Shire, what it does is it makes everything look like a set. And it is really strange because as you move on and as the drama becomes more CGI and as it becomes more action adventure, that initial problem, it becomes somewhat ameliorated. But in the opening sequence, there is this opening first half hour in which it's taking a very, very long time to do not very much. And all the problems of 48 frames, if problems they be for everyone, they are for me, I have to say, are absolutely accentuated and are at their worst.
This is a bit we're going to discuss after.
Yeah, no, fine, okay. After that, when they then set off on the quest, 2 things are happening all the way through the 2 things are happening are, on the one hand, the tone of the book is much more, is playing towards a younger audience. I mean, younger audiences will read The Hobbit, and that is then the thing that will lead them into The Lord of the Rings, and then they will grow up to be Led Zeppelin and write songs about it. That's how it works. Okay? Ramble on, exactly.
I played it yesterday.
Did you? Because you're on your all request.
No, that's today.
Okay. Oh, that's fun.
As you've broken and you just paused for thought, can I just mention that we've heard in the last few moments that the computer hacker Gary McKinnon will face no further criminal action in the UK, according to the Director of Public Prosecutions. That's Keir Starmer. More on the news in a few moments' time. So here we are, and we're young, and we've got into The Hobbit, and we're growing up.
And then, as the adventure starts, at least certainly as far as the film's concerned, the film is torn between 2 things, which is on the one hand that tone, the sort of knockabout, youthful, sort of fun, younger audience stuff of The Hobbit, and on the other hand, pardon me, the darker and more challenging stuff of The Lord of the Rings. And it seemed to me that after the first half an hour of the film, in which there was all the problems with 48 frames, all the problems with it looking like a set, all the problems with which
we're talking about after the news.
Yes. Then they start on the quest, and then all the way through there is a tension between, do we want this to be Lord of the Rings, or do we want this to be The Hobbit? And that, for me, was an unresolved tension. All the best bits in The Hobbit is when it looked like it was The Lord of the Rings. And the perfect example of that is the minute Gollum arrives on screen, you go, oh, and here we are. And suddenly everything falls into place. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a mad Andy Serkis fan, because I am. But honestly, if you watch the film, and it's not to say that there's not much to enjoy and like, but it is way too long. It has an awfully baggy first half an hour, which is at the very beginning of the movie. That's a lot to get through. But you look at the way everything changes. The minute Martin Freeman gets in the cave with Gollum, suddenly, and it's not just because you suddenly think, oh, great, it's it's Lord of the Rings. It's because the whole tone of the film changes. And I think that the biggest problem that it has is that it's trying to answer a number of different masters. It's trying to be, Peter Jackson talked about it in that interview to some extent, wanting to make The Hobbit, but also wanting to draw it into the Lord of the Rings. So the ring isn't central, but it is there. And for me, the minute Gollum comes on screen, the whole thing goes up about 5 gears. And that makes you go, okay, where have we been up until this point?
In a lower gear?
Yes, in a lower gear.
Okay.
Occasionally in a stationary gear.
Okay, so this is going to be continued because clearly Mark is only in his first gear. We are yet to hit 5th gear, then we'll be running downhill with wings. You were saying. So
basically, and I do think this is important. I think that if you're going to stretch a film to that length, there has to be a really good reason to do it. And I think this doesn't have it. And occasionally, I mean, there was a colleague or maybe a student of the profs said they've included the appendices. Like, this was a great thing. The funny thing, therefore, is that when you're watching The Hobbit, what you feel like, and you said this, is that it looks like the director's cut. It looks like they've got absolutely everything and put it on it. And the strange thing about that is that in terms of making a narrative work for cinema, just chucking everything in isn't necessarily the best way of doing it. I mean, actually, cinema often works best when streamlined. I mean, I have always felt that things, can be, you cut your lovies. I mean, the Roger Corman thing about very few movies couldn't lose a third of their running time.
Certainly, Kill Your Darlings, I think. Is
Cut Your Lovies isn't the other version of it. But in the case of this absolutely could lose a third of its running time. What that isn't to say is that there isn't any good stuff in it, because Peter Jackson is arguably the world's leading fantasy filmmaker. I remember how knocked out I was by the Lord of the Rings films. I remember, being so delighted when Return of the King finally got the accolades that it needed. And when you get to the Gollum sequence, you suddenly think, it's great. I mean, look at the way in which they're using motion capture. Look at the way in which it's completely character driven. Look at all the levels of that stuff going on. And there is so much in The Hobbit, but what I really wanted was somebody to go through it with a pair of gardening shears and take out 45 minutes so that it turned into a 2-hour movie. The other problem is that as it is at that length, it ends up looking somewhat like a TV miniseries, which is a problem which is confounded by the opening movement and the 48 frames thing, because 48 frames does, for better or worse, when you first see it, look like high-definition television. And
what's wrong with that?
Well, if it looks like high-definition television and it also appears to be mimicking a TV miniseries, that, I think, is not perhaps the best experience in terms of a cinema film.
We'll get to your correspondence. I think it's a lot of the reviews haven't got the balance right, because in
terms of my reviews, or
no, the reviews in general. So I think people are obviously going to have to go and make their own judgment once they've seen it. But because The Lord of the Rings was a masterpiece,
yes,
by comparison, it's not. It certainly is true. It is too long, and it's not a masterpiece.
Yes.
But there is so much stuff. I mean, I thought it's fantastically enjoyable.
Yeah.
It's a wonderfully enjoyable film. And usually, if a film has gone on too long, it's the last bit that gets all baggy. With this film, it's the first
bit that gets all baggy.
So get past the first 40 minutes.
It is Bilbo Baggy in the first 40 minutes, and then after that, it picks itself up and it gets on with being a film. That I mean, to some extent, that is hardwired into the book. As anyone who's read the book knows, there is an awful lot of sitting around and talking about songs that they used to sing and the Frith of the Froth of the Wrath and all that stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's a good idea to have that, for the film. But you must say that does not mean that it is not without enjoyment. It is not without pleasure. That he is not, a very, very accomplished fantasy filmmaker who clearly loves the source material. And when it works, it works. The problem is that the baggage around it, the Bilbo baggage around it, needs to be severely reined in. And we have to be honest. If I'm going to make this criticism of Quentin Tarantino, that what he needs is somebody standing over him with a big stick saying, "Quentin, 2 hours." 2 hours, and that's it. Not Kill Bill. Yeah, go ahead, make it into 2 movies. I do feel in this case, 2 2-hour movies is absolutely sufficient.